Hello, good evening. So probably just to give some more time for the others to join. So probably let's start by 8:02, 1 minute. Okay, so I think we can start now. So again, good evening everyone. So welcome to our April 2021 meetup for Ministry of Testing Philippines. So before I hand you over to our guest, let me just introduce to you Ministry of Testing. So I'm your host, by the way. So I'm Anthony Shumal. I'm currently the head of software quality for academics in Cambridge University Press. So again, so for those who don't know, MoT is the biggest and the most supportive global software testing community. We are actually present in 77 cities worldwide. And this is our mission. So coming together, make us advancing our industry in a positive and good direction. So, well, if you're actually noticing that my background is in Cambridge, but I'm actually in Manila. So, but Cambridge, MoT actually started in Cambridge, UK. So, for those who don't know, Cambridge, UK is considered as the Silicon Valley, or they call it Silicon Fen. Okay, so these are some of the meetup worldwide that is also somehow there could be also happening at the same time as well. And we are very young community here in Manila. We started 2 years ago. This is actually our second year actually, April 25, 2019. We actually launched MoT in Asian Institute of Management in collaboration with Masters in Business and Innovation. Okay. So we also have social media presence. So please visit Facebook or Facebook page, and welcome again. So we have our speaker. This is actually in collaboration with AWS User Group Philippines. So we're quite very lucky with our second year that we are also reaching with other communities as well. So, but before I hand you over with Alvin, which is a solutions architect in Amazon, so let me just give you some activities coming for the community. So we will have exploratory testing week that begins on April 26th. So I will be posting live videos from the MoT UK for this event. And also, this is the last event that I'll be advertising is the PH Tech Week on May 17 to 22. So we don't have meet up on May because we wanted each one of you to attend the PH Tech Week. So it is a collaboration between different communities as well. So I guess I can hand you over now with Alvin. Alvin?
Sorry, I was muted. All right, so thank you, Anthony. So let me just share my screen. All right. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see my screen. Okay, so thank you, Anthony, for introducing me. And first of all, I want to say thank you for MoT-PH for inviting AWS. And first, a little bit about myself. I'm Alvin Dalagon, and I'm a partner solutions architect for Amazon Web Services, and I'm based here in Manila. So prior to joining AWS, so I was also part of the team that developed Paymaya. So I'm not sure if anyone is using that here, but if you do, thank you very much for supporting it. So and I've been an AWS practitioner since 2009, and my primary programming language is Python, which I started 2005. So for today, we'll be discussing a little bit about quality engineering in terms of, and I will also discuss and double about how do you automate different kinds of tests in Python. Okay. Okay. So before we move on, so I just want to get my point across about why does automation matter. So I've been part of the team who developed Paymaya, and basically, if you're using it, one of the main features that we use for Paymaya is actually to transfer money, right? So you can actually transfer money to each other, or you can actually deposit money from banks or any kinds of methods. It might sound so simple and so mundane for the customers, but at the end of the day, on a technology perspective, you realize that sending money to someone is actually a very complicated thing. So one example is, let's say for example, a sample test case called send money. Um, First, the mobile app creates a money transfer request, and then the server will provide a response for transfer ID. The transfer request contains the information about the amount, the sender, and the receiver. And once the transfer ID has been confirmed, then the actual transaction will continue. Okay. So for every transaction, the basic ones would be is that the amount will be debited for will be debited to user X and then credited to user Y. And it could be as simple as that, but if you look at how complex fintech solutions are, is that there's actually some additional things that you have to test. One would be is that you have to check whether the transaction logs has been presented properly on the both parties. So the mobile app should show the transaction logs. And also you have to check if the notifications has been sent. So the notifications can be sent by push notification and SMS. And in addition, these are the things that the user doesn't see. Our QAs are asked to also test side effects. So side effects such as checking the core banking system if the balance are correct, checking the transaction logs, and making sure that the transaction logs are being instrumented for the data analytics team or the analysis later. And then also one of the hardest things to implement is actually implementing the anti-money laundering rules. So since we're dealing with real money here, fintech companies are also tasked to make sure that all transactions doesn't exceed a certain amount. So assuming that you're just a KYC level one, meaning you haven't provided much of your information to the bank, you're only limited to transactions such as 50,000 pesos per month. So anything beyond that, you have to be tagged, and the transfer should be flagged. Okay. And also the hardest thing is actually checking whether everything in the UI is being presented properly. And also, as needed during the times that we develop a Maya, is that conducting a performance test is actually quite expensive. So sometimes the performance test is actually not only done as needed. Okay, so and this is just one functionality. We only have said money. There's also other functionalities such as bills payment, such as buy load. So as you can see, uh, even though it's actually quite mundane and simple for the users, it ends up a big problem for the QAs. So one of the biggest challenges without automation, first of all, is that the traditional way of testing is that we write our test cases, and often they're just written in Excel. Some test cases might not be version controlled. Some might be outdated. Um, and also, even though as we try as much as we can, people sometimes doesn't try detailed stories. So it comes to the point, and it's actually most of the times that there's always a friction between the product people, the QAs, and the developers, is that it always stems with stories that are not clear, right? And most of the times, or during my career, I worked with a lot of QAs before. Is that most of the pain points for QAs is that they always complain that they're feeling the crunch at the end of the sprint. So uh, the QAs are always the last ones on the train, right? So they have to make sure and be as a gatekeeper for quality. And during the testing phase, we also noticed that the developers are mostly idle during the testing phase. So the developers might be just the ones who actually fixes the bugs, but most of the times they're quite idle. And one of the key problems with doing a performance test as needed basis, most of the bottlenecks are often found only in production, and that actually quite surprises us most of the time. And this problem magnifies as the product evolves. So PMI started as a quite simple system, but every now and then you may see that new additional features are added most of the times, and these things are actually added without the users feeling that the system is evolving at the back end. So that pretty much drives my point on how important on how to automate this test. It doesn't require us to automate everything, but at least we have to automate tests that actually makes us keeps us awake at night. So before I move on, just a word of caution. So I just want to be frank with everyone. I am by no means a practicing quality engineer. I don't write automated tests on a daily basis, but I dabble with it as needed. So I am primarily a software a Python developer before, but I also did some automation testing if as needed. And also over the years, I conducted trainings for QAs on how to automate tests using either Python or Node.js. So all of the concepts that will be presented during this talk is mostly introductory to the testing tools and the frameworks that you can employ if ever you choose Python as a baseline scripting language. Right? So without further ado, so let's start first. And probably one of the things why do we ask is that why Python? All right. So first of all, although I worked with cross-functional teams back then, and each of them having their own programming language and work method preference, there's always one thing that's stuck. Teams often code relied on Python. Okay, and sometimes JavaScript comes in second whenever they automate tests. It is actually due to the fact the simplicity of the language, and it comes with a great tool set and frameworks for writing automated tests. So for the next few slides, I will be talking a little bit about the tools and frameworks for a specific type of testing. And after that, we will do a quick run from this using a Jupyter notebook that I wrote for this presentation. Okay. And also just one thing that I also want to say is that the Python is actually a very simple language to the point that it was actually understood by QAs and hasn't programmed before. And even I teach my 7-year-old kid using this programming language. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this, but we have this thing called a testing pyramid. So sometimes you might ask, what is the ratio of unit tests and service and UI tests that you should write? So definitely we cannot write automated tests for everything. So you have to decide which tests matter most and invest time on that. So if you look at the testing pyramid, right, so you might see that the unit test is actually the faster test that you can write because of isolation. So you probably have to have a higher standards in terms of unit testing coverage. So most of the times, as a benchmark, our unit testing coverage usually I demand 87 to 90%. And then service tests comes in second, and then the UI test. So the UI test is actually one of the hardest things to automate. So that's why please don't force yourself to do all of the UI tests possible. Just make sure that you just have to nominate which UI test that actually really matters for you, and automate the ones that really takes your time. So if you want to have a proper guidance on how much test that you have to write, better read on test pyramid. So it's a link below. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different tests and what are the frameworks that you can use in Python. So the simplest thing would be unit testing framework. And for Python, we have this thing called unit test. So in the unit test, as you can see here, it's just a simple test case that's actually composed of a Python class that inherits from unit test case. And then there's actually this how typically it looks like. So you have four basic methods here. One would be the setup function. So the setup function is pretty much is like a method that's going to be triggered before all of the tests will be executed. So this is the best place wherein you can include your bootstrapping. So let's say, for example, if you need to connect the database or generate any input beforehand, you can do it on a setup method. Once the setup method is successful, and then each of the tests will be executed. So in unit test, it will automatically discover your test steps as long as it's actually prefixed with word test. Okay, so it's called here test underscore one and then test underscore n. So it can have any number of testing steps within a unit within a test case. And then lastly, the teardown. So the teardown, much like in setup, we're in setup, that's the bootstrapping for your test case. We have the teardown method that's going to be executed after all of the tests will be after all of the tests has been executed. So use write something on a database, you might as well delete that entry. And those things can be implemented on the teardown method. So basically, that's the test case, right? But for today, I will not talk. I will all talk double a little bit about unit tests, but I'll be recommending you guys to take a look at PyTest. So um, is actually an alternative to a unit test, and it has gained traction to the community. So as it has better features than the ones that's been included. Um, Another useful library that I always use, not just for testing, but also creating bots and do a little bit of web scraping is Faker library. So good unit test also makes use of random inputs rather than static, right? So and one of the most useful libraries that I use for generating input data or map data is Faker. So which actually I will also demo and discuss further later. Okay. So uh, moving up a bit on the testing pyramid are integration tests. Okay, so integration tests are types of tests which are in which we validate the correctness of interactions between software components. So it could be a component that interacts with another service through an interface or through an interface. So which actually nowadays RESTful APIs, right? So for writing integration tests in Python, I also recommend that you can use PyTest. So as you can see, there's a pattern here. So with regards to all of the types of the tests, you can just use one framework, which is PyTest. So you can use PyTest for it to manage your test cases, and also Faker to generate mock input, and also for making HTTP-based API calls. I highly recommend to use. You might also ask, why should I use Python for my integration test? So I do have some tools such as what do you call this one? Like Postman, right? So Postman can do some API testing as well, right? So there's totally nothing wrong with that. But if ever, it's not all of the time that you can actually use these tools. Sometimes you have to do some calculations such as after doing an API test, I have to connect to the database to verify if the entry has been successfully entered in the database. And that those things you cannot do that on a simple test. Then I highly recommend that you invest some time to learn a little bit of programming in Python. So now, if you're going to have to do some HTTP-based requests on a RESTful API, then you have a request library for that. Okay. And then UI testing. So UI testing is is on the top of the test pyramid due to the fact that it requires a larger effort than unit and integration tests. So nevertheless, for UI heavy applications, writing automated UI tests simply makes sense because you have to reduce the amount of repetitive and manual work. So let's say, for example, if your main functionality of your system is basically sending and receiving money, so might as well to automate the UI testing for that. But for other auxiliary features such as the help button or maybe um, the help button or just contact us button, then those are things that you don't need to do a UI test. So in terms of that, you really have to be smart and you have to really consider amongst yourselves and amongst your teams which UI test makes sense. Okay, so the de facto tool for UI testing web applications is definitely Selenium, and I'm pretty sure we do have a lot of testers in this call and probably heard of it. So luckily, Selenium is actually has a Python binding for that. And actually, libraries were built on top of the Python Selenium binding to make UI testing more simple. So in terms of the frameworks that you can use here, again, you can use PyTest to manage your test cases. And then Splinter. So Splinter is basically what you call this an abstraction layer for Selenium in Python. So there's nothing wrong writing UI tests using Python Selenium, but you'll often realize that if you use Splinter instead, it's actually easier. Okay. We will also double a little bit about performance testing later. So typically, if I need to load test an HTTP-based application, I often use a free software called Apache Bench. So, or sometimes called AD. If you want to have more detailed benchmarking tool with graphs and all, one of the easiest libraries that you can use is Locust. So I'm pretty sure there's tons of other load testing libraries here, such as JMeter and Artillery in Node.js. There's nothing wrong to choose any of those. Just choose what works for you. But for Python, I just find that this is the most simple one that I can use and the most visual one. So we will also run this on a demo later. Okay, so one of the key challenges working with disparate teams, right? So pretty much communicating with the business owners and the project managers, the QAs, and the developers. Is often the always problem is that the communication overhead, right? So, and one of the things that has been invented in order to improve the communications between the business owners up down to the technical implementers is that there's thing called the behavior driven development. So I'm not sure if everyone heard of this. I've worked with some teams who did BDD, and the main idea for BDD is that where this is actually we're in the practice we're in the test cases instead of writing them in free form Excel sheets, the product owner, the developers, and the QAs huddle together to write user stories during sprint planning. And these user stories can follow a certain format. It could be it's actually quite human and understandable. And you probably heard about the Gherkin syntax. So Gherkin syntax is actually pretty close to English language. So these user stories can be written in a standard human readable construct. And then this construct can be used as a contract for software devs and the QAs to do their work. So the main idea is that if you write your user stories this way, then it's actually easier to have. It's going to be less issues when it comes to communication overhead. Okay. And when it comes to behavior driven development, so it can actually use a Gherkin syntax. There's actually other BDD syntax that you can follow, but one of the most user friendly and popular ones are Gherkin. And as you can see in the middle, this where you just define the scenario and then provide the parameters. So it's actually quite close to the English language. And it's actually quite understandable enough, even to the point that a business owner can understand the features being developed. And one of the key advantages also for a Gherkin syntax is that you can actually use this spec to be your input for your test cases. So in this case, as you can see, there is an account balance of $100 and then withdraws $45. These inputs can be used as a context for your test cases later. Okay. Now, if you want to create test cases from a BDD syntax or a Gherkin syntax, you can again use PyTest, which has a plugin called PyTest BDD. A PyTest BDD can be used to automatically generate the stub or the boilerplate code for this Gherkin syntax. So I will also demo this later, given the time. So hopefully you find this useful. But I'm not forcing it to you guys. It really depends if you're working on an environment wherein it's actually highly controlled and a lot of regulations. It really makes sense to practice BDD. All right, so let's go on to the demo. So let me close my screen. Okay. So Anthony, so I just want to check whether you guys might see my browser at this point. I have my GitHub page open. Just want to validate that.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
And yeah, before you go for a demo, so let me remind everyone that you could use Slido for the question. And if in case you haven't access, you can also chat your question here as well. So we'll be reviewing that later.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. All right. So I really don't want to present everything in Dex, right? So instead of me talking to you about the framework, so might as well demo this to you guys. And it's actually one of the good key takeaways for everyone is that all of the demos and the sample codes that will be presented to you today will be available on my GitHub page. Okay. So the GitHub page is in here. So let me put that in chat. Let's see if we can. Where's the chat? Huh? Let's see. I don't see the chat. Okay, let's chat here for everyone to see. Okay, so I just pasted the link to the GitHub page on the Zoom chat box. So the demo for today is that I used the Jupyter Notebook. So Jupyter Notebook is actually one of the popular what do you call this IDE for machine learning practitioners in Python. So, but I also use Jupyter to teach people Python as well, because what's good with Jupyter is that you can create the notebooks, and the notebooks is actually composed of Markdown syntax and a Python syntax. And this syntax and the Python syntax can be executed directly from the notebook itself. So if you go to the GitHub page, so you can set it up by yourself down here. I have a step-by-step guide on how to set it up. But this one works with Linux and Mac. Unfortunately, I don't have a Windows machine to validate it. But if you do have a Windows machine, you can probably install Ubuntu for Windows, install Git, then follow these instructions, and you should be good to go. Okay. All right, so let's start first with the unit testing. Unit testing demo. Wait. Keeps blocking my view. Okay, so unit testing in Python. Okay, So one of the things that I used to be able to teach my kid programming in Python is that since he really likes Pokemon, right? And Pokemon is actually a good concept to teach class inheritance and object-oriented programming. So I will use this class as our test bed for writing our unit tests. Okay. So let me just quickly run through the source code that you see on the front. So in this case, I defined a Pokemon class wherein I have a constructor here that's actually executed whenever whenever the Pokemon class gets instantiated. Whenever you create a Pokemon, you have to define the name, and then you have to define what types of attacks that Pokemon can do. Okay. I do have some class methods here called add attack and attack. So in add attack, this is a class method wherein you can add the name of the attack and then the minimum and the maximum damage. Okay, and then stores that to the class variable called self attacks. Okay, and then lastly, I have a method here called attack that pretty much returns uh, a random range of damage given the minimum and the maximum amount of damage that was defined. Okay, so whenever you have to instantiate a new Pokemon, so it just looks like this. So we can specify the name of the Pokemon and then add the attack, tail whip with a minimum damage of 5 and 10, and then run the attack function. So if we test that, just click run here. And as you can see, I got a random value of 6, which is actually between 5 and 10. If I run this again, it's now 5. So pretty much the function here called random run range pretty much provides you a random number given the minimum and the maximum. Okay, so this is actually the class we're going to write at unit test with. Now, for unit test, so just like I mentioned on the decks, it's actually quite simple. So all you have to do is just import the unit test, create a class, and then inherit from the unit test case, which actually pretty much defines that this class is a test case and composed of individual test cases, test steps. I have my setup method here implemented wherein I created, instantiated a Pokemon and then added the attack. So that's pretty much my bootstrap piece of code before the test runs. And then I have three tests here. One is to test whether if the Pokemon name is the same as the user has provided. Test whether if the attack was added properly on the member function attack. And then a test that checks if the attack damage is within the boundaries of the minimum and the maximum that was defined. Okay. And then lastly, the teardown. So the teardown here is not implemented because I don't need any cleanup scripts here. Okay. So once you have this unit test, so you can actually just run it on your command line, or you can run it by this line of code. Okay. So if you run this, you should be able to see that Python automatically discovered these 3 cases and executed them. So yeah, as you can see, everything passes. There's OK. And you see here the amount of tests that was tested and 3 microseconds. It's actually quite fast. Okay. So I won't talk that much on each line of code because given the amount of time, but you can just look at the GitHub link and study it in much more detail later. Okay. Now, I was talking a little bit about PyTest. So now I just want to make sure to understand that why am I recommending PyTest? One would be is that PyTest can be used across different kinds of tests. So from unit test, integration test, up to the UI test. So if you have one testing framework, then the better is for you. So instead of you understanding different kinds of tools, right? Now, one of the key advantages also for PyTest is that this is actually has a plugin system. So they just move to a different page. So my link is quite old here. So PyTest actually has a lot of plugins that you can actually make use of. So let's say, for example, if you want to if you want to write unit tests that will require you to test asynchronous code, you have PyTest AIO here. if you want to, let's say, for example, create mock random mock input, you can use PyTest Faker. Okay, so PyTest is not just a test case framework. It's also as a plugin system that can be extended. Okay, so there's actually a link here if you want to further take a look at the plugins for the PyTest you can use. Okay, and actually for the plugins today, we'll be using the PyTest BDD and the PyTest printer. So we can run PyTest using CLI, but in this case, if you want to run it on Jupyter, so you have to run this cell first, which pretty much bootstraps PyTest. So let's click that run first. And as you can see, the unit test version, this is the unit test version, and this is the PyTest version. Okay. So let me explain a little bit here. So as you can see, there's a function here called def Pokemon. So the biggest difference between unit test and PyTest is that PyTest is function based, whereas in unit test they are class based. Okay. In PyTest, you have to define your fixture. So a fixture is basically a function that will be used. A function that will define the setup and the teardown of your test. So in this case, you can see here, I put a decorator here called PyTest fixture with a scope of module, meaning this whole module will be able, the scope of this Pokemon will be all across the code. Okay. And this piece of code is where my bootstrap is, wherein I instantiated the Pokemon and then added attack. So this is pretty much my setup. So pretty much the same as setup here, right? Now, anything after yield, which pretty much returns the Pokemon instance that will be used all across the tests here. Right after yield is pretty much your teardown code. So after yield, you can implement all of your cleanup scripts here. Now for the tests, so I have 3 test cases here. So pretty much the same here. Test if whether the name and the attacks was being provided, and check whether if the attack damage is within the bounds. So if we run this, it should be the same as the unit test. Okay. And also, one thing that you might have noticed is that why is there 6 tests that have been executed? Okay, so PyTest, by the way, I forgot to mention, PyTest also support unit tests. So if ever you have a team that already wrote unit tests in Python using the default on the built-in library called unit test, PyTest can also automatically discover this unit test and execute it. Okay. So as you can see, since we have 3 test cases that was 3 tests that was created by unit test, PyTest was able to discover that and execute it here. Okay, so that's actually one of the good things with PyTest. So you don't need to rewrite your existing unit test cases. Okay. Now, one of the things that a good unit test or any kinds of test is that you should not use static input, right? So the unit test that I wrote here, that inputs such as the Pokemon name, the name of the attack, and the values of the attacks are static, right? As much as possible, you want it to be randomized and to be able to cover more testing coverage, right? Now, instead of you creating senseless random strings, right? I often recommend to use Faker. Okay, a Faker library is available for both. I think it's available in Node.js and Python, and I think there's a binding also for Java. And one of the good things with Faker is that it can actually generate random stuff for you that are sensible. So let's say, for example, if you want to generate a sensible first name and last name, you can use Faker for that. So let's say, for example, let's run this piece of code. So I generated 5 fake names, 5 emails, and phone number. So as you can see here, we have randomized names that has been generated. Okay, so Faker is actually quite useful if you want to generate mock data, and instead of you creating a mock data stored on a CSV file or an Excel sheet, which is actually something that has been practiced before. So you can just generate mock data on the fly using this. So now, if we're going to improve our unit test using Faker, so all you have to do is import Faker on your test case. And on the fixture, you might notice here is that I used a fake name, a fake word for the attack, and a random integer for both the minimum and the maximum damage for the attack. So this is actually a better testing coverage instead of just using static inputs. So if we run this, we should pass. All right. Okay, so that's pretty much for unit test. So let's move on quickly to integration tests. Okay, so integration tests, as I mentioned, I'm pretty sure everyone knows this. So the only difference with unit tests is that the integration test test the interactivity between software components, right? So most of the most common things that you write whenever you do integration tests are basically writing tests for RESTful APIs. Okay, so for the demo, I'll be using a Json server here. So let me open that in a new tab. So let me talk a little bit about Json Server. So Json Server is actually one of the coolest open source tools that I always use. If ever you want to create a mock RESTful server, you can use the JSON placeholder, right? And most of the times, once the API contract has been finalized, the developers writes the API servers, right? So the QAs doesn't need to wait for the testers anymore. And so all you have to do, the QAs can create a mock API RESTful server using JSON placeholder. Okay, a JSON placeholder by default creates a RESTful API that has this endpoints such as posts, comments, albums, photos. So technically a blog site. So, but you can actually create your own customized mock server using Json Server. So for the demo later, we'll be using a RESTful server that was mocked by a Json server. So I have it, should have it running here on my local PC. So let's make sure let's run that. So my command is json.server patch.json. Okay. All right. So as you can see on my screen, I have a mock RESTful server running on my local PC, and we'll run our integration tests written in Python using using Json Server. Okay. So once that's running, so we'll be coming back here. Okay. So again, you can use PyTest for managing your test cases for integration tests. So let's run this piece of code first to bootstrap PyTest. Now, on a PyTest test case, we have this piece of code called conf-test.py. Okay, a conf-test.py is basically a place for you to place your configurations for your tests. Okay, so as you can see here, I created the class that contains some of the test configurations. So test configurations such as the endpoint of the RESTful API. And I also have a class here called storage that has user ID, username, and response. By default, there's no value. And I'll be using this class to be able to share the user profile that was being created across different test steps. Okay, so you can define your configuration and your shared data among tests on this file called contest. Okay. So let's run that now. And I have my integration test written in PyTest here. So let's just run you too quickly here. So I used the request library to make the API calls to my JSON server. We used PyTest library, and we defined the fixture wherein we instantiated a Faker instance, and then we created a user profile. So the test will be is that we're going to create a user, and instead of using a static input, so we'll be using Faker here to generate fake names, emails, phone, website, etc. here. And then we have this following functions. So whenever we write tests for RESTful APIs, right? So we create test steps for the CRUD functionalities. So basically for the get, for retrieving information, post for updating information, put for creating new objects, and then lastly delete. Okay, so for each CRUD steps, I created a test step here. So as you can see here, we test first the post. Use the request library to make the RESTful API call. So I have the config class here, which pretty much contains the endpoint URL here. And then posted the amount. I posted the data in JSON that was collected from the values that was generated on this fixture. And then we do a test whether if the status code is 201. So anything beyond that, then it's a failed test. We also store the user ID that was returned, the user ID that was returned by the JSON server, because we'll need the user ID for the subsequent tests, right? So the user ID is needed for the put test to check whether if we can update the user profile. We need the ID for retrieving the specific user and testing. Okay, so as you can see, that the steps here is actually quite self-explanatory. For put, I collected the ID, updated the. Let's say, for example, I generated a new name. Say, for example, updated the name of the existing user, and then check whether if the response is to 200, and also assert whether if the JSON object that was returned is same as we expect to. Okay. Now, once we have that, then did I execute it? Oh, not yet. So once we have that, all you have to do is just run this, and as you can see, each steps has passed, and there should be some activities on my JSON server. All right. Okay. So now let's double a little bit about BDD, right? So there's nothing wrong if you're not planning to use BDD, but actually a BDD can also be practiced for testing RESTful APIs. So as you can see here, we have a scenario. As you can see, we have a scenario for a CRUD model. So this is actually a very basic English type of a language wherein we have 4 scenarios. One is for adding user, updating user, get user, and delete user. Okay, and then as you can see, we can also make use of this. We can also make use of this input, such as if the response status is 201. We can also make use of the other parameters on the Gherkin syntax as our input for our test case later. Okay. Now, let's say, for example, if your product owners wrote the user stories using Gherkin syntax, and you're lucky that they're quite open to practice BDD. Now, the next step would be actually to generate Python test cases for you using using the Gherkin syntax, right? So you can write it by hand, but you can actually automatically generate the boilerplate code for the test case. So you can use PyTest BDD as a plugin. PyTest BDD will take in the spec that's actually written in Gherkin syntax and generate the test cases for you automatically. So let me just demo that for you. Okay, so in here I have a separate. So if you check out my code on GitHub, so you'll see here there's an SRC folder here, and I have the Gherkin syntax spec here under features folder, users_CRUD feature. So this is basically the Gherkin syntax, right? Now, if you want to generate the test cases here, so if you have PyTest BDD installed, so all you have to do is just type PyTest-BDD generate, and then provide the file wherein the Gherkin syntax is specified. And as you can see here, PyTest BDD automatically generates the test steps for you. So it is, instead of you writing this amount of code, by hand. So might as well just use PyTest BDD to automatically generate this. And one word of thing that you have to notice here is that some of the test cases here are not implemented, right? So there's no automated way yet to automatically generate the test case implementation for you, right? So by default, it's not implemented. So, but the boilerplate syntax has been automatically generated for you. So all you have to do is just implement the test. Okay. So on in here, as you can see, once you generate the boilerplate code, then you can actually start the implementing the each of the test scenarios on the test case that was generated by PyTest BDD. So what's good here is that we start off with a product owner understandable English language spec, then generate test case for that, and you can use the same spec for writing your test cases, and the developers can also use this spec for implementing their software. So yeah, basically the Gherkin syntax serves as your contract, and that pretty much minimizes your communication overhead. So it's actually quite useful. All right, so let me just quickly run this. So I have that the BDD integration test implemented here. So all you have to do is just run pytest -bd, pretty much verbose, and then pytest will automatically discover the test cases that you have on the current directory. And as you can see here, it automatically ran the test case that was first specified in Gherkin syntax and then written in Python. And if we check our Json server, there should be another activity. Okay, this one. So this is actually the automated test using BDD practice. So hopefully you guys you might see this interesting, so you can take a look more about Gherkin syntax. If you're interested in writing automated tests in JavaScript or Node.js, you can also use the Gherkin syntax. There's a framework called Cucumber that's pretty much does the same thing here. And then for UI testing, okay, so we have again you can use PyTest for that. So let's just run this here. And then the sample UI test that I'm going to go demo you today is that we're going to have a browser to open Amazon.com and then search for Kindle Paperwhite, which is actually one of my favorite products that was created by Amazon. Okay, so if we have a return or a list of Kindle Paperwhite products, then we can consider that UI test as passed. Okay, so you can actually use Selenium for this, but I highly recommend to use Splinter because it actually makes it much more easier than writing your UI test using Selenium. So let me just run through quickly the code. So PyTest as a native plugin for Splinter. So I have 3 fixtures here. One pretty much defines what the WebDriver that I'm going to use. So in this case, I'll be using my a Chrome web browser for this one. By default, this one I think uses the Gecko driver, which is pretty much powers the Mozilla Firefox, but you can also override this. So I'll be using Chrome here. There's a fixture here that pretty much defines whether if you want to run your UI test headless or not. So by default, if you want to run it headless, you can just return through here. You would want to configure it headless, especially if you're running your UI test on a CI server, say for example Jenkins that doesn't have a a monitor to display your browser, so you can run it headless. And I have a fixture here which pretty much defines that if ever there's a failure on a specific test scenario, create a screenshot and save an image so that you can see clearly what happened there. Okay. And then this is pretty much my test. So I have the URL configured here and pretty much tells the browser to visit this URL. And then first of all is that you have to find the search box, right? So you can actually use founder browser find by ID. And then once you've identified the DOM object that you want to interact with, then you can actually fill this is my search string, Kindle Paperwhite. And then I also have here the button so that my UI test will automatically click the button to trigger the search. And this is the DOM object that will be interacting with. Okay. So in this case, you might see here we have this thing called find by expat. Okay. So now, if you've done your UI tests before, or usually web tests, so you can either use the ID tags for each DOM, objects, but most of the times, like for example, the Amazon.com website is actually pretty complex, and it's hard to pinpoint the specific DOM elements that you want to interact with. So my one tip is actually you can use let's say for example, if you're using Firefox, we have this thing called developer tools. So as you can see in the screenshot here, you can just select the specific DOM element that you want to interact with, and then you can copy the expat in here. And then once you copy that expat, then you can use that expat and paste it here. So you don't have to find it. You don't need to understand the whole expat syntax here, because the expat syntax can be can be very complex, just like regex, right? So you can just use this tool for you to be able to easily discover the elements, right? So once I have it here, let's try to run this. Hopefully this opens my Chrome browser automatically. Here we go. Search for Kindle Paperwhite. There's a result, and then it closes. Okay, so it will be as fast as that. And as you can see here, the test case passed because we got we got results from Kindle Paperwhite. Okay, so it could be as simple as this, but you can create a much more complex UI testing. Right. Okay, then lastly, for the last demo for today, let's talk a little bit about Locus. Okay, so Locus is actually one of the easiest frameworks that I've worked with to do an HTTP load test for an RESTful API. So it's actually quite simple. So all you have to do is just create a class that inherits from HTTP user, and then it's very similar to unit test as well. So we have a function called onStart, which is basically your bootstrap function. This is where you can create your the objects that are needed for the bench test benchmark later. I have here the create profile, wherein I also use Faker to automatically generate random strings for my RESTful API. And then I have 4 tasks here that pretty much does RESTful API calls for creating users, adding for querying users, adding users, getting a specific user, updating a user, then lastly deleting a user. Okay. So unfortunately, this cannot be executed for Jupyter. So if you want to run this, you can check out my code and run it on the terminal. So in this case, I have my Json server running, and to clear this one, I have my performance test code written here. So let's run a Locus benchmark. So all you have to do, if you have Locus installed, you have you can just type in locus -f, then forgot the actual command. Locus -f and just specify the test code. All right. So once that runs, so it will tell you that the web interface is running on port 8089. So if we open our browser, we should have something that's running on localhost. So 127.0.0.1, 8089. Okay, so we have a locus web API here, where you can actually specify the total number of users assignment rate. So in this case, I'll create 10. The spawn rate, meaning how many users will be spawned in a matter of seconds. I'll just put 10 here. And the URL that we're going to test. So in this case, my Json server is running on port 3000. Okay. So let's start swarming. All right, so it's just currently doing its job. So let's see if I have some activities from our JSON server. Okay, as you can see, it's starting to benchmark it. And then if you look here, there's some useful charts that you can see here. The endpoints has been tested, and then you can actually see that, the charts here that provides you the total number of requests per second that was generated by Locust, and then the response time. Okay, now this is actually quite simplistic benchmark. So, but that you can actually run on your own laptop. But if you want to run a much more heavier benchmark, let's say for example multiple servers hitting your RESTful API, just to make sure you get the the baseline performance of your API server. Locust also has a plugin called Locust has a support for Swarm method. So meaning you can create multiple instances of Swarm clients, maybe running on AWS on an EC2 server or on a container, if you're familiar with Docker. And then you can swarm a lot of API calls to your API server. Okay. All right, so that's for performance. So let's head back to my Dex. So just keep it running. Let me see. So again, you can go to my GitHub page and check it out for yourselves. But now you might also ask, since we have created automated tests now, so let's take it further. If you have automated tests, then might as well include it to our release pipeline. So ideally, since you've already invested writing your automated test, it's actually quite useful to hook it to your CI system. So we have a lot of popular CI tools such as Jenkins, which actually I used before joining AWS. GitLab also has a GitLab CI. So these CI servers can automatically run your different kinds of tests. Let's say, for example, for every Git commit and Git push. So, and what's good here is that you don't need a QA to you don't need to tap a QA to run this automated test for you whenever you push code. Now, if you talk a little bit about one of the AWS offerings for testers is that we also have our own managed CI/CD system. So we have this thing called AWS Code Build. AWS Code Build is actually one of the managed CI/CD tools or developer tools that we offer. So if you don't want to manage Jenkins by yourselves, you can use a combination of code commit to store your code, and code build to build your code and run your unit test and load test or any kinds of tests, and then code deploy to automatically deploy that to your environments. And also, one thing to note, if you're managing testing environments, right? So such as test environment, such as staging or pre-prod environment. If your company is using cloud as your testing environment, it totally makes sense to automate your infrastructure as well. So we've seen companies wherein their testing environment is ephemeral, meaning their testing environments, which actually contains the servers, the databases, and all that, are actually provisioned whenever actually provisioned whenever you're going to run tests. And then after all of the tests has been done, then you can actually bring down the infrastructure and further saving you money. So instead of you maintaining your staging servers running 24/7 and you're still paying for that, everyone might as well try to understand to leverage on infrastructure automation tools such as AWS Cloud Formation and AWS Cloud Development Kit. Okay, AWS Cloud Development Kit is actually quite interesting. It is something that maybe MoT-PH might be interested learning later on. AWS Cloud Development Kit is basically a tool for you or a library for you that you can use to be able to provision cloud resources, whether it be an EC2 server or a database server or Lambda function. in Python. So instead of you manually using AWS console to provision this to provision your testing environment, you can just write it in Python. And if you write it in Python, it's actually easier to provision and bring down, especially if you're done with your testing. Now, I didn't tackle much about how to test the mobile apps given the time, but also when it comes to mobile apps, we have this thing called device farm. So one of the biggest problems with testing mobile apps is fragmentation, right? So at least at least for iOS, it's not a problem because the software, the operating system, and the hardware manufacturer is just one. But it's actually quite tedious to test Android applications, right? So because Android comes with different versions and different manufacturers with different configurations, so it's instead of you investing physical phones for your testing, we have this thing called device farm. So wherein we have an army of different mobile devices, whether it be a tablet or an iOS or an Android system, and from different manufacturers. So instead of buying them, you can just use device farm, and everything is actually run on the cloud, and you pay for the amount of time that you use these devices. And you can also access these devices remotely through a web browser, if in case if you want to test your mobile apps manually. Now, if you want to automate it, it also supports different UI automation tools for mobile apps, such as Appium, Calabash, and Espresso. You can upload this automated scripts on device farm, and this can then trigger your automated tests. And again, this automated UI test for mobile apps can also be triggered through your CI/CD platform, whether it be it's Jenkins or code commit or code pipeline. Okay. All right. So that's as much as I can explain in 1 hour. Hopefully, anyone got something out of it. But let's do a little bit of takeaway. So one would be is that I highly recommend you guys to check out PyTest. I really liked it. You can use it in different kinds of testing. Refer to the testing pyramid for you to be able to decide whether the amount of effort that you have to do, amount of time investment that you have to do, or a specific amount of tests. If you're in a team wherein there's a lot of stakeholders, I highly recommend you take a look at BDD, driven development, to have a single contract that the PO, the testers, and the developers can base onto. And also, I have also failed to mention that UI tests can easily break, especially if you're working with web developers that just keeps changing the UI, right? So you have to make sure that you work closely with your front-end developers to have a standard way of identifying UI elements. So let's say, for example, there's a standard way of using the ID tags so that it can easily be found even though the UI keeps changing. And then lastly, Python is actually a great language to learn, especially if you haven't automated tests before. So if you haven't written a code yet, I highly recommend you check out Python first. I also have a version of this in Node.js. So if you're interested, you can also find it on my GitHub page. Now you can run the code snippets on your own. I have the link here. And if ever, if you want to learn Python and how to use it on a day-to-day task, so let's say, for example, if you want to write your own API server or scrape a website, create bots, or if you want to interact with AWS APIs, I have another Jupyter notebook here, in fact, that you can actually check out. And then lastly, you also may download this deck in this link. So wait, let me just copy this link and put it on the chat so that anyone can download this. All right, so then, wait, and then, all right. And then lastly, one thing that I would really appreciate if you can give me feedback. This is actually our first time to talk for Ministry of Testing in PH. So I hopefully can give us a 1 minute of your time to give us a completely anonymous feedback. So you can actually either visit this link or just use the QR code on the right. So let me just share the link also on the chat. So give me a sec. All right. Then, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then that's everything. So again, thank you very much. And I think I don't know if we still do have some time for Q&A. I think I went over an hour.
I think
Do we still have
that's
anyone?
well. I think that's worth it, Alvin. I mean, this is quite really very interactive and very practical, actually. For sure, there are a lot of takeaway in terms of the framework. Probably you could just pick some question in the Slido.
Yeah,
Probably a
let's check it
three
out.
question, yeah, so that we won't do much overtime. While you're picking up, I think I also wanted to connect you because we are using AWS in our testing. I think there are a few things that I really wanted to understand, specifically the CI, the pipeline, and as well as the mobile devices.
Mhm.
Those things are since we are already in AWS, how we could utilize that further as well.
Yep.
And I
All
hope
right.
we have
So
a next session as well.
yeah, so I think it's actually highly worth it. Maybe on the feedback link, right? So I highly recommend if you're
Yes.
interested knowing more about device farm. I can demo that later, maybe on the next few
Yes,
discussions.
yes,
And
yes.
also CDK. CDK is actually one of my most favorite thing that came up from AWS because I'm a Python developer myself, so I don't want to do manual stuff. So if I can create my infrastructure using Python, then it's really good for me.
Okay, so
All
I
right.
think you must make sure that you have your feedback with Alvin so that we can have the next session. And I think Python is the next thing that you need to watch for because I think it's one of the most popular language right now.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just run through the questions first. So there's a question here. This if I'm familiar with robot framework. Sorry, unfortunately, I don't have any hands-on experience with robot framework for me to make any kind of comparison. But uh, yeah, I don't have a clear answer here because I haven't tested robot framework. But since I'm a developer and I'm quite familiar with unit tests, writing unit tests, PyTest is something that I really like because it follows the way how unit test is written. So, and also at the same time, it has a lot of plugins that I can use. So if you have actually one of the reasons why I also talk this to you is that I often mention to a lot of teams that testing is not just it's everyone's responsibility, not just testers. That's what I always say. Even the developers I work with, I always tell them that testing is actually part of everyone's responsibility. And teaching our developers on how to use PyTest to also automate the testing and to help our testers. It is something that they really liked because it actually follows a Pythonic way of writing unit tests. So that's pretty much my take on it. But how it compares on robot framework, I don't have a clear answer yet. And same thing with Playwright. So with Playwright, I'm not familiar with Playwright, so I cannot comment on that. Uh, but if Playwright is if Playwright is a wrapper for Selenium, then I think it might be quite similar to Splinter. But I tried to write an automated UI test using Selenium. It's actually quite verbose. You have to write a lot of code, and but Splinter is something that makes it really easy for me. So that's why I highly recommend it. If not Jupyter, what is the best IDE for coding and automating using Python? Okay, so okay, so when it comes to code editing, I always use Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So um, I think the Microsoft Visual Studio Code has some plugins also for writing unit tests and easily run your unit test by just a click of a button or a shortcut. So I really like VS Code. But before VS Code, I was using an Emacs user. So it pretty much what works for you. But if you ask me what is the best Python IDE, for me it's VS Code. Um, Okay. So there's a lot of questions here. Sorry, I'm just scanning. Okay. So where does contract
Maybe you
test?
just pick two question more. Yeah, so that
Okay. Sorry, can we have the GitHub link to the sample link later? I think it's on the chat. I just scroll up and probably have missed it. But I'll hopefully can someone paste it for me?
we also share it in the, I think the slide deck is also shared in the Ministry of Testing Philippines Facebook page, even your feedback
Hmm.
as well. So for those
Okay.
who are in the social media,
Yep. And there's a question here that how expensive to maintain the test within the PyTest? No, it's actually quite easy. If you're familiar with um, source code repositories such as Git, you can just maintain it. But for me, if you're using PyTest, there's a lot of ways to organize your code. You can actually organize it by modules. You can organize it by packages, or you can actually just organize it by Python file. So it's really up to you guys. But I can also, I think that there's some write up somewhere in the internet that talks a little bit about how would you organize your PyTest test. Then I highly suggest you just follow that. Okay. So maybe I just ask I answer one quick question here. So one would be is that can we create default data in Python? I don't quite understand this question. Maybe are you asking about map data? Okay, so yeah, in Python you can create your own map data, right? So there's ways for you to create random strings in Python, random numbers and all that. But sometimes random strings doesn't always work, right? So sometimes you should be sensible. So let's say, for example, if you want to test a web form that takes an email address or a phone number. So I highly recommend that you use Faker for that. So Faker generates random inputs in a more sensible manner, and it has a lot of built-in and community plugins, such as, say, for example, if you want to generate IP addresses, you can even do so in Python. Okay, so probably just one last question here. So where do you recommend to run performance tests? I mean, which endpoint to hit? Is it the dev environment? Is it the dev environment, staging environment, or the local environment? Okay, so if you ask me, I'd rather run it everywhere. So you can if you want to load test your API running on your laptop, so you can use Locust for that. Staging definitely can run performance tests there, and also production. So we actually have I also have experience wherein our production system that the things that the people are using, we actually have performance tests running just for us to test whether it does auto scaling is working or if ever the user experience is degrading. You just have to make sure that you have a proper way of cleaning the data afterwards. So let's say, for example, if you're doing a performance test on production, that will automatically generate users, right? So you might as well ask your developers to create an endpoint for you, a hidden endpoint for you to hit to be able to clean the users that have been created by your load testing. So now why did I answer this? Because as much as possible, if you want to discover your bottlenecks, if you can discover your bottlenecks earlier, the better. So that's why I often recommend that even to my developers, before you commit it to the code, if you have a way to even load test even just on your local laptop, please do so. So it can be as easily as just use Apache Bench or Locust for staging environment. So let's say, for example, if you have a CI/CD, right? So once you provision your testing environment using CloudFormation, deploy your code, and then you can create an EC2 server, a set of EC2 servers that's going to create a Locust swarm and bombard your API. Then, and then also of course, I highly recommend that you use application monitoring tools. I failed to mention that during the today's talk. So probably you've heard about New Relic uh, App Dynamics or Amazon X-Ray, right? So those are tools that are actually quite important, especially if you're doing load testing. So those application monitoring tools are agents that you can actually install on your application servers. And then during the load testing, if you have a bottleneck, you and your developers will have a better idea where the bottleneck is coming from. Because application monitoring tools can give you a better insight of what's really happening on your application. So let's say, for example, if your application is doing an API call to an external party, or your application is running an optimized SQL query, so might as well invest on implementing an APM prior to doing a load test. So it also makes sense to have an APM running on production. So if ever there's some bottlenecks that hasn't been identified by production by your performance test, sometimes your real users can even discover bottlenecks, right? So if you have APM on your production, then it's a better chance for you to solve your bottlenecks faster because you have a better insight of what's really happening.
Okay,
All
I
right.
think all right. So thank you, Alvin, for this very much worth topic for tonight. But before we end, so I think please do support AWS Philippine User Group, and they have actually some surprise to us as well. So I already have some free draw because of the time. So there will be three winners for Amazon credits for $25. So these are, so please message me in MOT Facebook page and give me your email. So we have Wilkinson Gaku. Okay, and we have Christopher Cuevas, and we have Benmar Vicente. So I repeat, these are the winners. So we have Wilkinson Gaku, Christopher Cuevas, and Benmar Vicente. So you won $25 worth of AWS credits. Okay, and thank you again, Alvin, for this wonderful talk. And of course, thank you so much, everyone. So Alvin, you might have other.
No, nothing much. So I've been speaking more than 1 hour now, so I need to
Okay, yeah,
grab some
yeah.
water.
Thank you so much. I
But
think
but
you've
again,
been.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
So
No, I
again,
mean, continue.
yeah, sorry, sorry. Again, thank you everyone for having me. And anyways, if you have anything that you want to learn more about AWS and not just testing, please do check out AWS user groups. They're an open invite. And then please, I really appreciate your feedback. I also want to improve my presentation skills. So please be frank. I won't be hurt. I actually much more looking forward about the things that I need to improve upon. And then be sure to identify the things that you want to learn next time. All
Okay.
right. So
Yeah.
that's pretty much it for me. And hopefully everyone stay safe and hopefully we can do this physically next time.
Yeah. Thank you, Alvin, and thank you for sharing your expertise. We really see your being passionate about in terms of what you're doing. So, I mean, extending your talk, given giving, we are in pandemic, so everyone is, also need to learn or to reskill. So thank you so much for sharing that and extending time for us. So again, so thank you so much. So I know you probably you will still have your dinner or probably going to bed. So thank you so much.
No problem.
See you again next time for our MOT event.
All right. Thank you
Thank
everyone for
you.
joining. Stay safe.
Stay
See you
safe.
on the
Thank
next
you.
one.
Bye. For the winners, please message me.
How do I stop my video? Thank you, Anthony.